Welcome back to Daybreak, and I'm your host, Randy Clark. The time is 6:32, and I got a very special guest with me this morning, Dr. Jonathan Douglas. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Doing good.
Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different.
I know it's usually pickleball.
Usually pickleball, but today we're talking about metal art. One of your hobbies, I guess. Is that right?
Hobbies, that you could say. Yeah. It's turned into a little more than that, but yes. Yeah.
So, metal art. And you got some props right here. You want to talk about your props first?
We sure can. So we're going to talk about a lot of things today, and metal art is kind of interesting. I mean, there's every type of art. There's a million different ways you can do something, but for me, the way I do it is I just find things that are basically going to be discarded. So scrap, and then scrap metal doesn't have the value it used to, and so that kind of led to being able to get some of these interesting pieces, and then I just like putting them together. And I didn't know if people would like it or not, but to tell you the truth, didn't really care, just kind of like doing it, and then started doing it, and then people said, hey, I really want that. And so it's turned into something a little more.
Right. So how did you get interested with becoming an artist?
So my dad is a great artist. He didn't do a lot of art. He did a lot of art when I was little, and then I think life got in the way and such. But I was always inspired by his art, and we always had some availability of art. And then we always had some kind of car that we were working on also. And so we had an oxyacetylene welder. So I grew up with a welder and welding something. I'd come home from school and there'd be something saying, hey, can we get working on this today? And we'd weld something that day. So I didn't realize that wasn't something that every kid had, but I had access to all kinds of things. And so we had pottery available, we had painting available, anything I wanted to do art-wise. And so grew up working around that. And then really didn't do anything with art for quite a while. And then we were in Washington State during the COVID times. And that summer of 2020, Washington was shut down. I mean, shut down. You couldn't do anything. Our office was open, but you really couldn't do anything at all. And so somehow, I don't remember how, I met this guy named Rat, and he was from Mississippi, and he was a scrapper. And I wish I could remember how I met him, and I wish I had a picture. I never got a picture of Rat. He was such a character. But I called him and I said, hey, I'm interested in starting to do some scrap metal work. And he said, you know what, I scrap transmission places, and what do you want? And I told him I want gears and chains and just that kind of stuff. And he said, okay. And he drove up in a truck that did not look like it should run, smoke coming out of it, like walls falling down, just trash. I mean, it was a mess. It was like something out of like Sanford and Son kind of a looking thing. And a bunch of guys pop out of the truck, and he said, I brought you stuff. And I said, okay. And he brought a 55-gallon drum out of the back. And I'm like, Rat, I don't know. You know, he had another name. It was like George or something. I said, George. He said, don't call me George. Call me Rat. I'm like, okay. Rat, I don't know. I don't need 55 gallons of this thing. And he said, well, I brought it. It's yours. You know, we'll get together and figure out what it was. And so it was way less than scrap prices. And all our neighbors, none of them did anything like this. And so there, I can see them all like looking out their windows, like what's going on? And now I got a 55-gallon drum, and he just dumps it on the ground. And now basically right in front of my driveway, I've got 55 gallons of rusty and dirty metal and whatever else, but beautiful stuff too. I saw that. And he said, let's go through it. And we went through it in the driveway. And I said, I like this, I don't like this. So he took some of it back, and then he came back, and we pretty much got it fine-tuned to where he would just bring me a drum of stuff that I wanted. He knew what I wanted. And then he also would say, hey, he'd give me a call, hey, I found something really fascinating. And he'd come by, and I'm like, yeah, that is exactly it. And so the pieces kind of come together. I never, somebody asked me recently, Logan asked me recently, how does it come together? I don't know. I don't really do anything with a plan. I just have a ton of metal, and I kind of know I want to make a bird. And so I start from that. And so my favorite medium to work with is metal, definitely. I paint and do other things too, but my favorite is metal, and it just kind of flows. And so, but I still have, Tara I know was very patient with me, but I shipped so much metal back because I'd spent so much time with Rat going through this stuff, and I know how hard it is to find like exactly the right gears. And right before we left Portland, a guy came in that worked on 18-wheelers, new patient, and I was just talking to him, and I said, what do you do? And he said, we redo transmissions. And I said, do you have any scrap sitting around? And he's like, are you kidding me? We ship all of it to Mexico. And so I said, can I come see it? And this was like 2 months before we left. And I went to this shop, and they cleaned it. It's because they shipped it to Mexico for them to reuse, because there are different standards on trucks, and so you can't reuse it here, but you can there. And I walked in, and it was like the heaven of metal art. I mean, beautiful stuff that was clean, and they were selling below scrap value because they didn't want to ship it. And I thought, of course, now how did I find this? And so I'm going to have to find something like that here, but I've got so much metal right now, I don't really need it. But that's kind of a long-winded story of how I got into it. Rat and me in the summer of 2020, and we also had a neighbor who was a hoarder, and she had all this fascinating stuff in her house, and we helped her son clean it out after she died. And so we went over there, and that's actually where this piece, I was trying to remember this morning when I grabbed this one, that's where this piece came from. She had an old table sitting in her backyard that had just basically rotted away, but it had these 3 beautiful cast iron supports to it. And I thought, that kind of looks like the mouth of a bird or something. I'll just pull them off. And so I pulled them off, and so finding pieces like that is kind of, and we'd go walk the dogs, and I'd say, man, that's an interesting piece of metal right there, right? And Tara'd shake her head, and I'd put it in my pocket, and we'd kind of move on, but it kind of all comes together like that.
So, some people see junk, some people see money, some people see art, right?
Yeah, and I love it, and you can turn this into money too, and we had a lot of people, there's something called a steampunk movement, and people like this kind of retro stuff that looks kind of futuristic, and so I started making lamps, and those were popular, and the birds, and then I started making fish, and fish were very popular, and then I made a pig, and I'm gonna have to make more pigs because people saw the pig and people really want more pigs. I just haven't had time to do it because I made it as a barbecue trophy, and so it turned into that. Guy really wanted it because he had a friend he did competitions with, and so you just never know, but this stuff gets scrapped and it just goes away, and some of it's just so beautiful that I hate for that to be the case.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you use to produce art?
So we find it kind of starts with this kind of stuff. So Rat would show up and he'd have a whole 55-gallon drum of
Looks like a
gear.
transmission gear.
It's just a transmission gear, right? And there's one right here. There's an eye, see? So
Right.
the eye. So what this would become, you can either turn it like that, or you can have an eye that looks like that, or you can have an eye that looks like that. Typically with my art, I'm using a welder, this a wire feed, and it's a flux core, and it's a cheap Harbor Freight kind of welder. I have a nice welder, but I really like my cheap one, tell you the truth, because it's so easy. So I have a dirty side and I have a clean side. When you use flux core, it pops and you get all kinds of stuff. I could clean it up. It's not really worth it. I just produce them with one side. And so the way I start is I grab a piece of chain, and then the chain can become any shape. And I have so much chain. I mean, chain is not hard to find in the scrap world. There's not much they can do with it, right? And so all you do is you take a piece of chain and then you make it in the shape of a bird. And then I go with the welder and I tack every joint. And then once it's tacked, then I essentially have kind of a weak outline. It's not strong enough to hold up itself, but it's strong enough to start with. And then I lay it down, and then I start putting things like gears in there, and then I tack those in place.
Right.
And then I'll tack the bigger things I want, so I got some other gears in there. And then once I get the big elements in, then I start going in with nuts and washers, and so I brought some. So you might fill in a space like this, and then I just go tack, tack, tack.
Right.
And you wouldn't believe how strong it becomes, because I've got no strong welds in this at all. There's nothing structural. It's just a bunch of tacks, but once you do about 1,000 tacks on the back of something, then it'll hold up.
Right.
I mean, and we're not standing on this thing. So it's just all kinds of different components. We got some rocker arms, and we got some bolts, and then this is some kind of transmission component. I don't know all these things, to tell you the truth, but I need something as a heavy base. That's generally the last piece that I look on. So I create this flat, and then I put legs on it, and then I bring it up, and then I just kind of make the piece fit whatever base is there. And then sometimes there's a balance problem with metal. I've done some things, now this is kind of embarrassing, you wouldn't imagine this, but I've done some things where I've built them and couldn't move them. And so just because I can pick this up, and just because I can pick that up, doesn't mean that I can pick up like 100 of them that have now come together. So I've got a lamp at my studio that, I mean, it takes 2 people, and it's everything 2 people could do to move this lamp. But of course, when I was welding it, I'm like, oh, this is simple, boom, boom, boom. And then now I got this like 200-pound lamp, this awkward and spins around and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, it's interesting. The other thing, though, that I figured out once Rat started bringing them is that a lot of these things, these bearings still articulate.
Right.
And so you can work that into it. So I have quite a few of my lamps and other things that actually move. And you can create an element of that that's kind of interesting too. You just kind of have to think of it, but it's basically just free form, and I just throw stuff on the table and start putting it together, and it kind of all comes together somehow.
You kind of have a vision of what you want, or you just throw it down there and just kind of.
I generally have a vision like it's going to be a bird or it's going to be a fish. And then the funny thing about chain is that you'd think you could make it into any shape, but different chain has these different articulations, so you can't make as tight a turn as you think. And then also when you're tacking it, the wire coming out will sometimes give you a little push. Right? And I'm not really, I mean, when you're doing 1,000 welds, I don't have time to I could lock this thing down and make it very precise. Build a jig or something. I don't have time for that. So I'm just going and like tack, tack. And so sometimes you'll have a straight line on the chain and I'll tack it and it moves up and like, well, that's just part of that's a part of it now. I mean, that's what happened. And I don't know on this one if I had any, but this one kind of turned out smooth. But here I kind of had a tail and I couldn't make this turn go any tighter because the chain wouldn't go any tighter.
Right.
And so the design just ends up being what the material will give you, essentially.
So, now that you're here in Sylacauga, and I know you brought a lot of stuff with you, but have you managed to find some other art pieces while you're here? Let me rephrase that. Met some people that's got other art pieces.
So I
know a couple.
Yeah, and I don't know any other metal artists in the area. I have found quite a few people who have connections with transmission shops and all the above, but I don't have my studio completed. And moving from Washington, starting a practice, all the things we've been doing, pickleball, I haven't had time to get it done. So I don't need to bring any more metal in until I do. But I have seen some amazing pieces of metal art at Collier's. There's a guy, I don't know who that was, but built this giant articulated robot. And I've done some robots. I mean, this thing really lends itself to robots too. So yeah, there are some amazing people around here. And you wouldn't really, most of the metal artists aren't really like artists for a job. Yeah, and so you open up garages sometimes. I've been to people's houses like, wow, you do cool stuff, but we don't really, it's not like it's out there because it's not something we do. If people want it, we can do it, but it's not our profession generally.
What kind of welder's required to do metal art?
Yeah, so you could do anything.
You mentioned
I have a cheap titanium 125 at Harbor Freight. Look for it on sale. It's like $150. You can't go wrong. And I've had so many welders look at that thing, come by and look at it, and they're like, that's a cheap, I wouldn't use that, right? And I mean, welders are kind of stuck up about their weld. It's got to be a certain kind of welder. And I said, well, I grew up with a nice welder also. I'm just telling you, give it a shot and let's see. So I have a friend, Lou Peters, who's actually an amazing artist in lots of ways, welder also, underwater welder. Like this guy knows his welding. He saw that thing with me. We were working at the animal shelter. He's like, man, I don't know if this is going to do the job. He said, I'm going to buy one. Like when he left, he went and bought one. Everybody does. This titanium 125 is the best little welder. I've never found anything it won't do. Okay. Then I have stick and I have TIG and I have all the other things. So if I want to make a two-sided one, then I'm going to pull out TIG and I'm going to spend a ton of time and detail on these welds and whatever. But in general, that's not so much fun because it kind of becomes tedious. So a wire feed flux core is generally the way to go, I think.
So, what are some of the examples of things that you've created? I mean, you've mentioned a bird and the fish, but I'm sure you got other
birds and fish.
things.
So my favorite thing to do is I actually have about a 5.5 foot tall full figure. And so when we were cleaning out this hoarding house in Washington, it was next to us during that summer of 2020, the person collected antiques and she had a lot of antique clothing and she had a lot of mannequins. And so I thought, a mannequin would be a really good form for doing what I do. And so I took the mannequins and I got body plaster like you'd use for a cast. And I cast them, and I can change anything I want at the casting stage. And then when you flip that thing over, I should have brought a piece of plaster. I can do that if you ever want me to bring it back. You lay this thing down, and then you put a bolt through the plaster, and that gives you a ground. And then I take one of these nuts, and that's my starting point. And then all you do is start expanding up with nuts or washers into it, and then pretty soon you have a pretty much exact image, negative basically, of what that is. And so I've created giant figures, and then I create this metal base to it too. And then I've done a lot, I like woodworking also, so I've done some side tables that have a metal base to them, have like a camshaft coming up and a big flywheel base. And I also love wood turning, and so I've really started doing more where I combine something like this, but it would have a wood-turned base. So I just find some interesting wood and then put it on the lathe and create whatever I create. Again, not specific, but just something that looks interesting, and then mount it on top. And I figured out a way to put screws into the metal, and then I literally just weld the metal into the wood, and then I weld the wood to the whole thing. So it becomes, because I tried epoxy, that doesn't work. It's not really strong enough because this metal has junk on it. It's hard to clean or whatever. So I figured out a way to weld the wood to, you just have to have a space to get to it. But yeah, there's just been a lot of experimentation of it. But I could pretty much do anything metal art. I want to do some really big birds out at my dad's farm. I've got these old roofing shovels that look like a bird foot and have a long handle to them. And I'd like to do some like 8 foot tall kind of interesting stuff. So there's a lot out there. It's just finding the time to do it.
Right. Yeah. Well, you're into a little bit of everything.
I know that.
I want to ask you a question. A question about something. I think, if I'm, correct me, but was your first at the Marble Festival? You come down and sculpted a piece. What did you find out from that? I mean, I know you like to do it.
From working with
you
marble.
You also created a bird, right?
Yeah, so I got down to I didn't have time to take off work, didn't have any way to take off work for 2 weeks. So the last couple of days of the Marble Festival, some of the sculptors had to leave. They had a bunch of big groups coming through. And so I've always wanted to go down there. And I thought, you know what, I'll just shut down on Thursday afternoon with patients and grab stuff and run down. And there was a beautiful piece of marble. And I figured out very quickly, everybody else had been there for 2 weeks and they had a lot of time to detail their stuff and whatever. I didn't have that kind of time. So I just thought about making like a metal art in bird. That's all I could do. I'm just gonna have to make it kind of blocky and kind of abstract. And so I grabbed power tools and I had a grinder and I was cutting stuff and it was just dust. And everybody else was at the detail, like the, barely sanding stage. And here I am, like, zip, 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 stuff dropping off. But I actually kind of like my bird. The more it's in the office.
Too. Yeah, I thought it turned out great.
Yeah, I don't think actually if I'd been there 2 weeks, I would have wanted to do something different. I kind of like the way it's angular, and I like the way it's different from everybody else's. It's just it's a very Art Deco kind of a bird, which is a style that I really like. So I'm gonna do more marble.
I thought it turned out great.
I love it. I love doing it, and it was just very.
Don't stop doing it.
I mean, I just beaten on it, and we made it work.
Yeah,
so, yeah
it looked
somehow.
good. It really did. And I talked to the visitors. You got a lot of compliments out of it, Jonathan.
Yeah, I had a lot of people that liked it. I was surprised. Yeah,
right.
And a lot of people came up and said, "Stop." A lot of artists, and I said, "Really? Not artists in the sculpture festival, but I mean just artists." They're like, "This thing is rough and it's angular and whatever. Don't try to make it something it's not." And I said, "I agree. That's kind of where I'm going with it because you don't really finish art; you just abandon it, as we were talking about a little while ago, and." You could work on it your whole life to make it exactly right or whatever, but it was what it was. I had a timeline. I knew by like 1 o'clock on Friday, that was my shutdown time. So it was like zip, 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 and then at 1, shut it down. And I see a lot of things I'd improve, but it is what it is.
Well, maybe the next piece you do, you can add these improvements.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you learn every time.
But really, I kind of like the beginnings of it.
The roughness of it is beautiful. Yeah. It really is. I think so many times we refine things. It's like cars that are over restored. You go to a show and you know it didn't come from the factory looking like that. And it's amazing to see what people can do. Sometimes it's more interesting to see the one that's been in a barn and it's actually had life. So I feel like with art, sometimes you can overdo it where it's sometimes interesting to see the roughness because you kind of see the process with that. Right.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming in and bringing this metal art. It's beautiful. I think it's great.
I love doing it.
Yes. Jonathan Douglas, Dr. Jonathan Douglas, Broadway Spinal Care. I hadn't found anything Jonathan can't do yet.
There's probably stuff.
I mean, pickleball, and he'll fix you up if you got an injury too. I'm living proof. He keeps me going.
We do.
So thank you for coming in and continue on your marble art. I thought you did a great piece. And continue this too. If you never need any help, I'm available.
I appreciate that, buddy.
And we'll be right back. Thank you, Dr. Jonathan Douglas. We'll be right back with Daybreak. Stay tuned for more.